There comes a moment in life when the quiet weight you have been carrying becomes impossible to ignore. Not because the world suddenly changes, but because something within you refuses to remain divided any longer. Choosing yourself does not arrive with fireworks or approval. It arrives as a subtle but decisive shift, a recognition that your inner truth can no longer be negotiated away for comfort, belonging, or fear of loss. At first, this choice feels unsettling. Old roles begin to loosen. Familiar patterns no longer fit. You realize how much of your life was shaped by adaptation rather than authenticity. When you choose yourself, the unconscious begins to surface what was long suppressed. Emotions you postponed, desires you dismissed, boundaries you never enforced all rise into awareness. This can feel chaotic, even lonely, because the identity you once relied on was built around external validation. But beneath that discomfort is a growing sense of inner alignment. You stop explaining yourself unnecessarily. You stop shrinking to preserve harmony. The need to be understood by everyone fades, replaced by the need to be honest with yourself. As this process deepens, relationships begin to change. Some grow stronger, others fall away. This is not punishment or failure. It is the natural reorganization that occurs when you stop betraying your inner life. You start recognizing where you gave too much, where you stayed silent, where you confused attachment with love. Choosing yourself clarifies these distinctions. You no longer chase connection at the cost of self-respect. You allow distance where there was dependency and depth where there was performance. Your relationship with fear also transforms. Fear no longer dictates your decisions, but it does not disappear either. Instead, it becomes a signal. You recognize that fear often guards the doorway to meaningful growth. Rather than retreating, you learn to pause, observe, and move forward with awareness. You begin acting from intention rather than reaction. Life stops feeling like something that happens to you and starts feeling like something you participate in consciously. Over time, this inner shift reshapes how you move through the world. You become less driven by urgency and more guided by clarity. You no longer measure your worth through productivity or approval. There is a quiet confidence that emerges, rooted not in certainty, but in self-trust. You understand that choosing yourself is not selfishness. It is the foundation of integrity. From this place your actions carry weight, your words carry truth, and your presence becomes grounded. Choosing yourself does not make life easier, but it makes it honest. And honesty, once embraced, becomes the most stable ground you will ever stand on. Choosing yourself rarely feels like a moment of triumph. It usually begins as an uncomfortable tension, a quiet but persistent conflict that grows inside long before any visible change occurs. This inner struggle does not announce itself clearly. It shows up as restlessness, dissatisfaction, or a sense that you are living slightly out of alignment with your own values. On the surface, everything may appear acceptable. You may be meeting expectations, fulfilling roles, and receiving approval. Yet beneath that structure, something feels unresolved, as if a part of you is being asked to remain silent in order to maintain peace. This conflict intensifies when you realize how deeply external approval has shaped your decisions. Many choices are made not because they resonate internally, but because they are rewarded socially. Praise, acceptance, and belonging become subtle currencies that guide behavior. Over time, this creates a split between who you are and who you present to the world. Choosing yourself begins the moment you become aware of this divide. Awareness alone can be unsettling because it forces you to acknowledge how often you have adjusted your truth to fit into someone else's expectations. The inner conflict sharpens as you start questioning long-held assumptions about what you should want. Goals that once felt meaningful begin to feel hollow. Commitments that once felt necessary start to feel heavy. This does not mean those paths were wrong. It means you have outgrown the version of yourself that needed them. Growth creates friction, and that friction is often mistaken for failure. In reality, it is the psyche signaling that the current way of living no longer reflects your inner reality. At this stage, external approval loses its comforting power. Validation may still arrive, but it feels insufficient. Compliments no longer quiet the discomfort. Achievements no longer compensate for the sense of disconnection. This is where many people turn back, choosing familiarity over authenticity. The inner conflict feels too costly. It threatens relationships, identity, and the narrative you have built about yourself. Yet this tension is not a sign that something is wrong. It is evidence that something essential is trying to emerge. As you remain with this conflict rather than escaping it, a subtle shift occurs. You begin listening inwardly instead of scanning outward for reassurance. Decisions slow down. You hesitate not from fear but from discernment. You start noticing which actions drain you and which ones restore a sense of inner coherence. This process is not dramatic. It is often quiet, private, and deeply personal. No one may applaud it. In fact, it may go unnoticed entirely. Choosing yourself in this way demands courage because it offers no immediate reward. There is no guarantee of understanding or support. The approval you once relied on may diminish, and with it, the identity built around being accepted. But in that loss, something more stable begins to form. You develop a relationship with yourself that is no longer dependent on reflection from others. The inner conflict that once felt threatening becomes a compass, guiding you toward a life that is internally aligned rather than externally validated. As awareness deepens, what was once buried beneath routine and distraction begins to rise into consciousness. Suppressed emotions and unspoken truths do not disappear simply because they were ignored. They wait, held in the unconscious, shaping behavior from behind the scenes. Increased awareness acts like light entering a darkened room. It does not create what is revealed, it exposes what was already there. This exposure can feel overwhelming at first, because it disrupts the illusion of control built on avoidance and silence. Many emotions are suppressed not because they are weak, but because they were inconvenient at the time they emerged. Anger may have threatened belonging. Sadness may have felt too heavy to carry when survival demanded strength. Desire may have conflicted with expectations placed upon you. To cope, the mind learns to push these experiences aside, labeling them inappropriate or dangerous. Over time, this suppression becomes automatic. You stop noticing what you feel and start functioning on habit, performing roles rather than responding honestly to life. When awareness increases, this system begins to loosen. You may notice sudden waves of emotion without an obvious trigger. Old memories resurface. Reactions feel stronger than the present moment seems to justify. This is not regression. It is integration attempting to occur. The psyche releases what it has been holding once it senses there is enough safety to do so. Awareness creates that safety not by eliminating discomfort, but by allowing it to be witnessed without immediate judgment or suppression. Truths emerge alongside emotions. These truths often challenge the image you hold of yourself or the story you have been telling others. You may recognize that certain relationships were maintained out of fear rather than love. You may see how often you said yes when you meant no. You may realize that a path that you committed to no longer reflects who you are becoming. These realizations can feel destabilizing because they undermine familiar narratives. Yet they also bring clarity. They reveal the cost of living out of alignment and the quiet exhaustion that came with it. As suppressed material surfaces, resistance naturally follows. The mind seeks to reassert control, to explain away discomfort, to return to what feels known. But awareness does not operate through force. It operates through presence. The more you stay present with what arises, the less power it holds over you unconsciously. Emotions that were once feared begin to soften when they are allowed expression. They move, shift, and eventually settle, rather than remaining fixed and reactive. This process requires patience. There is no linear timeline for how long suppressed emotions take to surface or integrate. Some emerge gently, others arrive with intensity. What matters is not managing them perfectly, but allowing them space without self-rejection. Each acknowledged emotion restores a fragment of inner truth. Each recognized truth reduces the distance between who you are and how you live. Increased awareness does not make life immediately easier. It makes it more honest. And honesty, though uncomfortable at first, brings a sense of internal coherence that cannot be achieved through suppression. What surfaces is not meant to overwhelm you, it is meant to. When authenticity begins to replace adaptation, relationships inevitably shift. For a long time, many connections are maintained through subtle adjustments of the self. You learn what to say, what to hide, and how to behave in order to preserve closeness. This kind of a different rhythm in relationships, one based on choice rather than obligation. Authenticity also changes how conflict is experienced. Instead of being avoided or absorbed, it is addressed with greater awareness. Disagreements become less about winning or pleasing and more about understanding. This does not eliminate tension. but it prevents resentment from accumulating beneath politeness. Truth, when expressed with care, allows relationships to either realign or naturally fall away without unnecessary damage. As relationships reorganize, you may find yourself standing in quieter social spaces. Fewer connections, but more meaningful ones. This is not isolation, it is refinement. By releasing adaptation, you create room for relationships that can meet you where you are, not where you learn to position yourself. What remains is a network shaped by honesty, where presence replaces performance and connection feels earned rather than maintained through self-erasure. Fear is often treated as something to overcome, suppress, or eliminate, as though its presence automatically signals weakness or failure. Yet fear does not arise without purpose. It appears at moments where something meaningful is at stake, where familiar patterns are being questioned, and where growth demands movement into uncertainty. When fear is approached with awareness rather than avoidance, its role begins to change. It no longer functions as a barrier that blocks progress, but as a signal pointing toward areas that require attention, honesty, and courage. Most fear is learned through experience. It develops as a protective response, shaped by moments when vulnerability led to pain or rejection. Over time, the mind uses fear to maintain safety by discouraging risk. This mechanism works well for physical survival, but it becomes limiting when applied to emotional and psychological growth. Fear then starts governing decisions that are not truly dangerous, only unfamiliar. Opportunities are avoided not because they are harmful, but because they challenge identity, attachment, or control. When awareness increases, fear is no longer immediately obeyed. Instead of reacting, you pause and observe it. You begin asking what the fear is protecting and what it might be preventing. This shift alone changes its influence. Fear loses its authority as a command and becomes information. It reveals where you are attached to certainty, where you are avoiding discomfort, and where your sense of self feels most fragile. In this way, fear highlights the edges of your current capacity, showing where expansion is possible. As fear becomes a guide, its intensity often decreases. This does not mean it disappears, but it becomes more specific. You notice the difference between fear that warns of genuine harm and fear that arises from stepping beyond familiar roles. The latter often accompanies moments of authenticity and change. Speaking honestly, setting boundaries, pursuing a path that aligns with your inner values all tend to activate fear, not because they are wrong, but because they disrupt established patterns of adaptation. Following fear with awareness requires restraint. Instead of forcing yourself forward or retreating entirely, you learn to move deliberately. You act with intention while acknowledging discomfort. This approach builds trust within yourself. Each time you respond to fear thoughtfully rather than impulsively, you strengthen your capacity to navigate uncertainty. Confidence then emerges not from the absence of fear, but from your ability to remain present while it exists. Over time, fear becomes a marker of significance. You begin recognizing that the areas you avoid most consistently are often those connected to growth, creativity, and truth. Fear points to where something matters. It signals that an old identity is being challenged and that a new orientation is forming. By listening instead of resisting, you allow fear to inform your choices with controlling them. In this relationship, fear no longer defines limits. It outlines thresholds. It shows you where the next step requires awareness rather than avoidance. When treated this way, fear becomes an ally in transformation, guiding you toward a life shaped by intention, honesty, and conscious participation, rather than by the silent rule of avoidance. The need for validation develops early as a way to secure belonging and safety. Approval becomes a mirror through which you learn who you are and whether you are acceptable. Over time, this reliance on external confirmation can quietly replace inner guidance. Decisions are shaped by how they will be received rather than how they feel internally. When self-trust begins to form, this dynamic starts to shift. The shift is not sudden or dramatic. It unfolds gradually as you learn to listen inwardly and take your own perceptions seriously. Self-trust grows through experience, not affirmation. It develops when you act in alignment with your inner values and observe the consequences honestly. Each time you choose according to your understanding rather than external pressure, you reinforce the belief that you can navigate life from within. This does not mean every decision leads to comfort or success. Some choices bring difficulty or misunderstanding. Yet even these outcomes contribute to self-trust because they confirm that you can withstand discomfort without abandoning yourself. As self-trust strengthens, the need for validation weakens. Praise no longer feels necessary for reassurance, and criticism loses its power to destabilize. Feedback is still noticed, but it is weighed rather than absorbed. You become less reactive to others' opinions because your sense of worth is no longer outsourced. This creates emotional steadiness. You are not lifted by approval nor diminished by disapproval. Instead, you remain oriented toward your own sense of truth. This shift affects how you present yourself. You speak with greater clarity and less defensiveness. You stop over-explaining your choices or justifying your boundaries. Silence becomes easier to tolerate even when it is met with misunderstanding. The urge to prove yourself fades because proof is no longer required. Your actions become simpler, more direct, and less performative. You begin to value coherence over applause. Letting go of validation can feel uncomfortable at first. Without constant external feedback, there may be moments of doubt or loneliness. The familiar reassurance of approval is no longer there to guide you, yet this discomfort is part of the transition. It creates space for discernment. You learn to sit with uncertainty and consult your inner sense rather than seeking immediate confirmation. Over time, this practice builds resilience and clarity. Self-trust also reshapes relationships. You are less likely to seek approval through compliance or self-sacrifice. You engage more honestly, expressing needs without fear of rejection. This honesty may reduce some connections while strengthening others. The relationships that remain are grounded in mutual respect rather than dependency. You relate as a whole person, not as someone seeking permission to exist. As self-trust replaces the need for validation, life feels quieter but more grounded. Decisions are made with intention rather than urgency. You move forward without constantly checking for approval. This does not make you immune to doubt, but it gives you a stable center from which to respond. In that stability, you find a freedom that external validation could never provide, one rooted in confidence that comes from knowing and honoring yourself. Integrity is often misunderstood as moral rigidity or perfection, but in its deeper sense, it refers to inner wholeness. It is the alignment between what you know inwardly, what you choose, and how you act in the world. When integrity becomes central, life is no longer organized around appearances or convenience, but around coherence. This shift changes how meaning is experienced, not as something pursued externally, but as something that emerges naturally from living in accordance with one's inner truth. Without integrity, life fragments. You may say one thing and feel another, desire one path while walking a different one. These splits create quiet tension that accumulates over time. Even success feels hollow when it is achieved through self-betrayal. Integrity resolves this tension not by demanding flawlessness, but by inviting honesty. It asks for awareness of where you compromise yourself and the willingness to correct course when you notice it. This process restores trust in your own actions. As integrity strengthens, decision-making becomes clearer. You are less driven by short-term rewards or the fear of disapproval. Instead, choices are evaluated through a simple internal question: does this align with what I know to be true for me? This clarity reduces inner conflict. Even difficult decisions carry a sense of calm because they are rooted in self-respect. Meaning then arises not from outcomes but from the way choices are made. Living with integrity also reshapes your relationship with effort and sacrifice. You stop giving energy to pursuits that contradict your values, even if they promise recognition or security. This can initially feel like loss, as familiar structures fall away. Yet what replaces them is a deeper sense of purpose. Your time and attention are invested in what resonates internally, creating a sense of contribution that feels authentic rather than forced. Integrity demands courage because it exposes inconsistency. It requires acknowledging when actions drift away from values and taking responsibility for that gap. This honesty can be uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. By admitting misalignment, you regain the ability to change. Meaning deepens through this accountability as life becomes a continual process of refinement rather than a performance to be maintained. Relationships are also transformed by integrity. You show up more consistently, without hidden agendas or unspoken resentments. Trust develops naturally when others sense that your words and actions are aligned. Even conflict carries less bitterness, because it is addressed directly rather than disguised through politeness. This consistency creates depth in connection and reduces the emotional exhaustion caused by pretense. Over time, integrity creates a stable inner foundation. You may still face uncertainty, failure, and doubt, but you meet these experiences without losing yourself. Meaning is no longer dependent on control or recognition. It is rooted in the quiet confidence that comes from living honestly. When integrity guides your life, fulfillment is not something you chase. It is something that unfolds through alignment, moment by moment, as you remain faithful to your inner truth. And when you look back, you will realize that choosing yourself was never about turning away from life or from others. It was about stepping into it without division. The inner conflict of fear, the loss of approval, and the reorganization of relationships were not obstacles placed in your path, but signs that you were moving closer to truth. What once felt like uncertainty became guidance. What once demanded validation was replaced by self-trust. What once fragmented your energy was unified through integrity. A meaningful life is not built by pleasing everyone or avoiding discomfort. It is built by listening inwardly and acting with honesty, even when the ground feels unsteady. When you live this way, your presence becomes steady, your choices become clear, and your path, though imperfect, becomes your own. This is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a life lived from alignment rather than fear, from wholeness rather than compromise.